In this lesson, I want to give you a thorough overview of armatures. Later in the course, we'll be jumping in and getting our hands dirty, so to speak. We'll be looking at how to use constraints and how to connect your armature to the mesh and all that good stuff. But for this overview, I want to look at the anatomy of an armature first. So what is an armature? An armature is a container for one thing: bones. Armatures can be displayed in many different forms: octahedral, stick, B-bone, envelope, and wire. You can even have a bone take on any custom shape that you want. You'll learn how to do that later in the course. But here is our bone in its default state. Isn't it beautiful? Every bone has three parts. It has a head, a tail, and this middle section here, which isn't officially named, but I'm just going to go ahead and call it the body. And these three things together are considered one bone in Blender. In other software, you might have a joint at the start, a joint at the end, and this middle section would be called a bone. That's three objects in total versus one in Blender. Now, the reason I mention that is for this case. What if we had a connected set of bones like this, where the head of the bone was connected to the tail of the other? In other software, you might only have one joint in the middle here. But in Blender, the head and the tail both exist. They're just over the top of each other. And this is true if the bone is marked as a connected parent or an offset parent, which you'll learn about later. But every bone always has a head and a tail, even if they're in the same 3D space. Bones always pivot around their head, like this. They also have their own axes, which shows you the orientation inside the armature object. This little widget here shows the orientation of this bone, and it will display at the head of the bone. You can slide this along the bone if you wish. I'll show you that later in this video as well. But it's important to know that the length of the bone will always be the positive y-axis. And the x and the z-axis is always dependent on what's called the bone roll. So when you place your bones in edit mode, you can think about as placing the head and the tail where you need them to be. That will take care of the y-axis. And then you adjust this bone roll to sort out the x and the z-axes. Anyway, let's jump into Blender and look at some important settings and where to find them. So the first thing you want to do is learn how to actually add an armature. Just like any other object inside Blender, it's going to appear at the 3D cursor. So if I was to add it in this location, I would say that we've made our first mistake. We should always return our cursor back to the world origin and place our armature at the origin point. This is going to save you many headaches in rigging, so it's an awesome habit to get into right now. So now my cursor's at the center. I'm going to hit Shift A to add an armature. We just go click, and then a single bone will appear. Now, if you happen to have the Rigify add-on enabled, that menu is going to look slightly different. You're going to have a few more options, but the one that says single bone is the same as the default one when you don't have Rigify enabled at all. But this is just worth noting if you happen to enable that sometime in the future and you're wondering why the menu has changed. So that's how we've added our armature. You can see up here in the outliner, we've got the armature name, and this is the armature data. At the moment, these names are the same. You can click in here and rename them if you like. You can also click down here in the Object tab, or you can hit F2 with your mouse over the 3D viewport. I'll just rename my armature to my armature, but you'll notice that's only renamed the object and not the actual data that lives inside that. It's always a good idea to keep these in sync so that if you ever need to import the data into a different file, you actually know what it's called. This is another good habit to get into. So we can rename the data in the Data tab down here. So this would be the place to rename the data, or you can rename it in the outliner as well. I'm just going to copy the name here and paste it there. Now, armatures have three different modes. If we jump up here into the menu, you can see we've got object mode, edit mode, and pose mode. So you can change the mode from up here in this menu, or you can use the pie menu, which is Control tab by default, but because of my preferences, I can just bring this up with tab. And then we can jump into object mode, pose mode, or edit mode. So what is the purpose of object mode? We can see when I move this around, I'm actually moving the whole object container. We can tell that because the orange dot is the object origin, and that's moving away from the world origin. So object mode is how we can position the whole entire object inside 3D space. However, as I've already mentioned, we always want to rig with our armature at the world origin. So we want to make sure that the location is 0, 0, 0. It has 0 rotations, and then all the scales should be 1, 1, 1. That's going to save you many, many headaches when you're rigging. Our next mode is edit mode, and this is where we actually build our rig inside the armature object. I've just created some random bones here, but you can see that the object origin, this orange dot, is still at the world origin. Edit mode is where you'll be adding and building your rig. And then finally, we have pose mode. This actually has two purposes. Pose mode is where you add constraints to your bone. We'll go over that later in the course. And it's also where you add your beautiful animation or terrible animation. It's up to you, really. But we won't be covering any animation in this course because it's all about rigging. You'll get to know what mode you're in just visually by the color of the bones. So when we're in object mode, you can see that the outline of this bone, or if you have more than one bone, the whole entire thing will be this orangey color. When we jump into edit mode, there's more of a yellowy orange here. And when we jump into pose mode, the default color is blue. Now the colors do change depending on whether we have constraints or whether we've actually added a bone color. You will learn more about that later. But generally, object mode is orange, edit mode is yellow, and pose mode is blue. There's a few things that I want to go over in the properties panel over here. I won't be explaining absolutely everything, but I do just want to point out a few things in a couple of the tabs. We'll quickly look at the object properties tab, which uses this square icon, the data properties tab, which for an armature looks like a green stick man. And then I'll point out a few things with the bone tab here, which is the green bone icon, and the bone constraint tab as well. But with those ones, we're actually going to look at the bone constraints and the bones in some great detail in some later videos. So first up, our object properties tab. The first thing we can see is this transforms here. That is a duplicate copy of this information up here. But as I said, with rigging, we want to make sure that our locations and our rotations are at 0 and our scale is at 1. Now under here we have the relations tab. This would be where you want to parent the armature to a different object. However, when we're rigging, we want the armature to be at the top level of the hierarchy. So you would parent the other objects, say your mesh and any other helper objects, you would parent them to your control armature. However, in animation, you might need to parent your armature to another object to make it follow along. But as I said, when we're rigging, the control armature is going to be at the top level of the hierarchy. Everything else is going to be parented to that one. You won't need to touch anything else in this relations tab. Underneath that, we have the collections. So at the moment, it's in the collection called collection. That's the only collection we have in our scene at the moment. We can use this tab to create new collections and create an offset on each axis, but generally I only use this tab to add the control armature to more than one collection. And that would be using the add to collection button. We only have one collection at the moment, so I can't do that now, but later on you'll see me do this when we set up a real character rig. We don't need to worry about the motion paths or visibility. However, under the viewport display, we can display the name. However, this is going to display the name of the armature object, not the name of the bone, so it's not really that useful for us. There's a similar option under the data tab for that one. And this is also the axes for the object. So that's not really useful for us. We want to show the axes of the bone, which is also under this green data tab. However, it is useful to use this in front option. I'm going to enable that and then just stick a cube in our way. Now, when we have in front enabled, you can actually see the armature through the mesh, which is very, very handy when we're rigging because often the bones are inside the mesh and we want to be able to see what we're doing. So we can enable in front, or we can actually enable the X-ray up here. You can toggle that with Alt Z if you like. I think you'll find this in front is more useful. However, one thing that I would recommend is changing your display type, the display as, from the default texture down to wire. Then we can actually see through our bones, and you can actually see that I had a hidden bone inside there. So with this wire option, you can see through our bones. So over in our data tab, that is our green stick man, we have a few options that I want to point out. The first up here is the pose. Now by default, it is on pose position, which means that we can actually move our bones in pose mode, and technically we're animating them. So if we jump back into edit mode, you'll see they jump back into their rest position. So if you actually want to mute any of the transforms in our bones when you're in pose mode, you can change it to rest position here. And that is going to reset everything back to its rest value while you're in pose mode. This can be helpful when you're trying to debug an issue where perhaps a constraint might be causing one of your bones to be rotated the wrong way or be in the wrong position. And when you jump forwards and backwards, you'll be able to see, my bones are moving, and then further diagnose what the issue is there. Just don't forget to enable pose position again. But if you do try and move your bones with rest position enabled, you will get this message pop up saying that rest position is enabled. So don't forget to turn it back to normal when you've finished debugging your problem. Now here is where our bone collections are. We can add them, subtract them if we like, but I'll go over this in more detail in the next video. The next tab I want to explain is the viewport display. Here is where we can change the default look of our armature. We've got octahedral, we've got stick, we've got B-bone, and we've got envelope. I think you'll find that octahedral and B-bone are the best because you can actually change the visual size of your bones. And doing that doesn't actually change anything about how it functions, it's just visually how it displays. So now I can select these two bones when they're over the top of each other. And don't worry, I'll go over those shortcuts in a later video. Next up is the names. This is going to show us the names of our bones. So this is more helpful than the names in our object panel. Shapes here, if we have any custom shapes on our bones, we want to make sure that that is enabled so that our control shapes show up. That is enabled by default, so you really don't need to turn that off unless you're trying to debug something and the shape is getting in your way. You can turn them all off and see where your bones really are in 3D space. The next option will do a similar thing with the colors on your bones. If you add any colors to your bones, this checkbox will let you disable that if you wish, but we'll go over bone colors in another video. And here is another in front option. This is actually a duplicate of the same option that was in the object properties tab. It's just in two spots, so it's more convenient for you. Here we have our axes. You can turn that on, and that's displaying the axes of our bone. This is the one that is more useful to us than the one in the object panel. And you can see we can actually slide it along the head or the tail, but I'd suggest just leaving it at 0, which is the head of the bone, because that is where the bones pivot from, and it's less confusing to your mind. And then when bones are parented, I'll just parent these bones. You can actually see this relationship line. And with this toggle here, we can show where that is connected to. Is it going to connect it to the tail of the bone, or is it going to connect it to the head of the bone? We can turn off our relationship lines if we like. Up here in the overlays menu, we can just disable that there, and then you won't see it at all. But I think you can leave that at the default settings. And here we have the IK settings for our armature. You can leave this one alone as well, as we've got specific IK settings on our bone tab. And the final one here is our custom properties. You'll notice that there's many different places that we can create a custom property. Here's the one on the object level. Here's the one on the data level. And there's also one down here on the bone level. So if you're going to add a custom property, where would you most likely add it? Well, more often than not, you're going to be adding it on the bone level. Sometimes you add it on the data level, and then very, very occasionally you'll add a custom property on the object level. But I'll cover each one of those situations if we happen to get there. At this level, all you need to know is there's many places to put it, but most often you'll be putting a custom property on the bone itself. And then in our bone tab, I want to point out that the information shown over here is going to be different if you're in edit mode or you're in pose mode. At the moment, we're in pose mode. If we change over to edit mode, you'll see that the information is slightly different. However, some of the information is doubled up, like the deform option that's available in both modes. You'll learn more about that later. Some of the information is visible in both modes, but it's only editable in one, like the bone parenting. You can see it in both, but you can only change that in edit mode. And some information is only available in one specific mode. And we'll go over all the specifics in the next video. So how do you know which mode the information you're looking for will be in? Just as a rough kind of way of thinking about it, edit mode is where we're positioning our bones inside the armature. So it's going to show you all the things to do with its rest position. And when we're in pose mode, this is the information to do with anything related to animation or constraints, anything moving it away from its rest position. And the final tab I want to point out here is the bone constraints tab. This is where you add your bone constraints inside the pose mode. It is different to this constraints tab here. This one is for the object constraints. This one here is for the bone constraints. And you notice that it's only editable and visible when you're in pose mode. Well, actually, you can see it when you're in object mode, but you can't edit anything when you're in object mode. And it is totally invisible when you are in edit mode. So pose mode is where you want to be working on your bone constraints. That's all for this anatomy of an armature. There's a bunch more to learn, but we'll continue that in the next lesson, which is going to be all about those crazy things called bones.